Good evening, or good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are around the world. I'm Sue Black, and I have the honour of being the president of the Royal Anthropological Institute. And I'm really glad to be able to welcome you all here this evening to the Curl Lecture. The Curl Lecture is offered every 2 years and is a way to feature the work of outstanding younger scholars. Rachel Crellin studied archaeology and anthropology at the University of Cambridge, where she developed a keen interest in archaeological theory and material culture. After taking her MA at UCL, she studied at Newcastle University for her doctorate, which was focused on theoretical approaches to the study of change and drew on a study of the transition from the late Neolithic to the early Bronze Age on the Isle of Man. Rachel completed a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship between 2015 and 2017 at Leicester University, where she lectures today. Dr. Crellin's primary research interest is the study and theorization of transitions in human society, which she's explored in her recent monograph, Change and Archaeology, published in 2020. And it is with great pleasure that we invite her to deliver tonight's Curl Lecture entitled Posthumanist Feminist Archaeology, A Becoming. Rachel, I'm so looking forward to this. And if I can hand it over to you for the next 50 minutes or so.
All right, let's see if we can share my screen. So thanks to Sue for that really kind introduction. It's a real honor to deliver the Curl Lecture. And when David contacted me about the Curl, I cast my eye over the list of previous lecturers and quickly became rather nervous. This was back in July 2020, and we optimistically wondered whether the event might go ahead in person. Here we are many months later on Zoom, and I'm still feeling quite nervous. There we go. So this evening, my lecture is about the potential of posthumanist feminism in archaeology. I'll try to make the case that the discipline of archaeology, the present world that we share, and our futures require a new theoretical approach to the study of the past. Rather than dwelling in the negative that often threatens to overwhelm us, I argue that an archaeology rooted in posthuman feminism offers us an affirmative foundation from which to contribute to the work of building new worlds we want to be a part of. I am someone who would describe herself as a posthumanist and an assemblage theorist. I don't understand the world in terms of bounded entities, and I do my best thinking and writing with others. So before we launch into the lecture proper, I want to highlight that much of the thinking that this paper emerges from is work with other people, both human and other than human. In particular, the paper here draws in part on a jointly authored paper with Hannah Cobb that's been accepted for publication in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal as part of a special section on posthuman feminism edited by myself and Hannah. The paper also draws on a book I'm currently writing with long-term collaborators Craig Sapola and Ollie Harris, titled Archaeology for Today and Tomorrow. So let's begin. The world is a troubling place right now. Archaeology as a discipline is no different. We've seen universities threaten to cut archaeology at Chester, though they've since removed that threat. We've seen the move to close archaeology courses at Worcester, the closure of courses at Hull, and the proposed shutting of the world-leading department in Sheffield. In the commercial sector, we're seeing a skills shortage as archaeological units struggle to recruit enough staff. Pay remains too low and conditions too poor for many of our graduates, particularly those that come from more diverse backgrounds, to see their future in our commercial sector. Boris Johnson's cry of build, build, build on June 30th this year was accompanied by extensive plans to overhaul the planning system in England to make it easier for developers by cutting so-called red tape, including archaeological and environmental mitigations. And whilst this legislation is now on pause following his recent cabinet reshuffle, we fear what lies ahead. The newly appointed Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries, signed off on demolition of the Dorman Long Tower in Redcar within her first few days in office, sending a clear signal that industrial working class heritage is of little value in Tory Britain. At the same time, we've seen the government openly criticise bodies like the National Trust and academics like my own colleague at Leicester, Corinne Fowler, for highlighting the connections between the English past and slavery. Following the tearing down of the statue of the slaver Edward Colston in Bristol, the government is set to bring in new legislation, which gives the Communities Secretary the final decision on the removal of any contentious statues. It's easy to feel like archaeology is under attack. Whilst the commercial and university situation seems grim, the so-called culture war from the Tory government indicates something of the power of the past and archaeology, even if it does feel very uncomfortable. When we look within the field of archaeology itself, it can also be dispiriting. UK data shows that the gender pay gap in professional archaeology has narrowed significantly from a 70-30 male-female split in 1997 to almost equal figures in 2012 when the last survey was published. Yet pay across the sector remains low, and when we drill down into the data, we can see that the seemingly greater gender equality in the workforce isn't distributed through the age brackets or indeed the pay grades. From the age of 40 onwards, most archaeologists are men. That the picture painted in these figures is one which frames gender as a binary is in itself problematic and unrepresentative. The statistics also show that archaeologists in the UK are 99% white and 98% able-bodied. And the figures have remained almost static over the years. Worryingly, research by Hannah Cobb has shown that the student body in the UK is much more diverse than our workforce, highlighting the presence of significant barriers to progression into the profession. And whilst these data are all specific to the UK, the problems highlighted are not. Where comparable statistics exist elsewhere, similar pictures emerge. Our despair at the state of our discipline is further exacerbated because these problems aren't new. Archaeologists have been addressing gendered and intersectional inequality for nearly 40 years, beginning with Margaret Conkey and Janet Spector's revolutionary Archaeology and the Study of Gender, and extending through archaeology's movements to become engendered, intersectional, anti-colonial, and queer. Yet in 2021, we still see in practice many of the same inequalities highlighted by those who've gone before us, and it makes the problems seem insurmountable. In the picture painted here, the prospects for both archaeology, and more importantly, for an equitable archaeology, seem bleak, and anger, exhaustion, and despair can feel inevitable. When we turn to the broader world around us, things don't feel much better either. We live in volatile political times. The far right and populism are resurgent, white supremacy is rising, xenophobic attitudes shape our politics, homophobia and transphobic discrimination continue, and the pervasive and powerful nature of the patriarchy runs through all of these. At the same time, the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in loss of life across the world. It's leading to long-term health consequences for those who've had the illness. It's crippled world economies, made large numbers unemployed, and brought healthcare systems to their knees. COVID-19 has cast inequalities in a new light. We've seen how poverty, disadvantage, and race all intersect to allow the virus to spread and kill more quickly. Who gets sick and who cares for them whilst they're sick, meant in the broadest possible terms, shines a light on structural inequality. COVID-19 is not just a disruptor, it's also a catalyst that exacerbates already existent problems and inequalities. On top of all of this, we're living in the climate crisis. The International Panel on Climate Change's 6th report identified unprecedented and irreversible changes in the climate across the globe. The report notes that without immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 or even 2 degrees C will become beyond our reach. Whilst the climate change is having a global effect, the results are, just like those of the pandemic, not evenly felt, with those who already live in poverty likely to suffer more adversely. This is exhausting. The feeling of despair in the face of all of this is absolutely real. But as the posthumanist philosopher Rosie Braidotti tells us, despair is not a project, affirmation is. Braidotti begins one of her own books by laying out how the prevailing state of society and of academia has led her to feel such crushing and exhausting waves of despair and anger. She then builds an argument for countering this with affirmative ethics. Affirmative ethics are about turning to the potential of positive affirmative action. She says, what the world needs now is a heavy dose of counter negativity. Her message is that anger and opposition alone are not enough. They need to be transformed into the power to act so as to become a constitutive force. And what I hope today is to bring a little bit of that counter negativity in my talk. so that we are not consumed by despair, but instead make positive action our project. There are, of course, communities who have been fighting pitched battles against inequality and injustice for decades, from climate activists to Indigenous peoples, anti-racist groups, or disability and LGBTQI+ rights activists. They show us that despair is not the option. Our future world demands more of us. It demands that we do better, and I want to argue in this lecture that we think better too. So why in all of this would you want to be an archaeologist in amongst all of this despair when there might be better ways to spend our time and our energy? A friend and colleague, Rob Hedge, answered this question when he was blogging about the cuts to archaeology courses at Worcester. Why do we do it? Why do we do archaeology? And he tells us that it's because archaeology is fun, and it is. And we all need fun and affirmation in the face of despair. But more importantly still than that, in our search for affirmative action, archaeology is also a radical subject with radical potential. It's a subject that has the potential to help us build new worlds in the future because of the way in which encounters with the past provoke us to think differently. Archaeology is traditionally defined as the study of the material remains of the past. In the popular imagination, it's associated with meticulous, slow work to uncover long lost worlds and people. Archaeology, though, is not just about the past. Like many others, I see archaeology, even the weird academic versions of it I take part in, as a part of our world, not just a way of describing and commenting on it. Archaeology might often focus on the past, but it happens in the present world. It affects the present world and shapes the future worlds that we're creating. This means that it would be irresponsible for us practitioners to falsely sever those connections and pretend that archaeology isn't part of the present context, part of the present problems, and has the potential to be part of their solutions too. Putting our heads in the sand, focusing on ever more accurate descriptions of the past, better radiocarbon dates, even more aDNA sequences, and ignoring our own entanglement with the present world might well seem appealing, given all the grimness just described. But both ambivalence and despair aren't the options for us. And there is excellent work already going on in archaeology that focuses on how we might make a difference in the world, how archaeology can be relevant. And this work is wide-ranging and diverse. Here I want to discuss briefly 4 different possible approaches to making archaeology relevant. My first example comes from those archaeologists who've turned their anger at our discipline into action, activist archaeologists. We've seen a fluorescence of activist movements within archaeology in recent years, aiming to make the discipline itself fairer and more diverse. In the UK, there are a range of grassroots organisations such as Mentoring Women in Archaeology, the British Women Archaeologists, and Trailblazers. There are also several recently established foundations and societies, such as the Enabled Archaeology Foundation and the European Society for Black and Allied Archaeologists. Equity issues are also being strongly contested by unions who represent archaeologists. And they've begun to impact top-down organisations too, such as the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, the professional body for archaeologists in the UK. They founded an equality and diversity group in 2015, which has led to subsequent changes in the way inclusivity is embedded throughout the organisation's practice. The work of the group also stimulated the production of a pan-sectoral strategy and statement on bullying, harassment, and discrimination in 2019. And this in turn has led to some notable action. For example, the Seeing Red project came from the grassroots organisation Mentoring Women in Archaeology, or MOI for short, and it's highlighted the difficulties faced by those who menstruate whilst working in archaeology due to the failure to provide even basic clean facilities to allow them to change sanitary products hygienically and in private. The project now provides period pads to commercial units to make a material difference to the working conditions. Meanwhile, the Badger Respect Guide has highlighted sexual harassment in archaeology, and subsequent research following the launch of the project has shown a shift in professional culture surrounding harassment and reporting. This activism isn't limited to Britain. Organisations such as the Society for Black Archaeologists, the Indigenous Archaeology Collective, and the Black Trowel Collective have all led on equity issues. Exhausted and angry archaeologists have turned to activism, and they're working to change the material conditions we live and work in, to make our subject open to more people from more diverse backgrounds. Something that Jero, Conkey and Wiley, and indeed Ruth Tringham, who was celebrated earlier today by the RAI, have been telling us is key to producing different narratives of the past since the 1980s. The road ahead is long, but this kind of work is affirmative. It provides us with the inspiration to keep going rather than throw in the trowel. Activist archaeologists need not focus on remaking our discipline. We can also focus on rewriting our pasts. In this type of work, often drawing on neo-Marxist theory, archaeologists are able to deploy their work for social and public good, challenging the structural inequalities of late capitalism. Activist archaeology builds new knowledge about the world, constructs new critiques of the world, and takes action to change it. It strives for a more humane world with less alienation and more emancipation, focusing on the broader social collective, particularly underrepresented groups and groups suffering from long-term structural violence of capitalism and settler colonialism. The general principles here also often underlie a strand of more participatory activist archaeology, working with a range of disenfranchised groups. For example, Operation Nightingale and Waterloo Uncovered in the UK both provide rehabilitation for soldiers through archaeological excavations. Researchers also considered the mental health benefits of historic landscapes and how they can contribute to wellness and healthcare. These approaches deliver unquestionable benefits for the communities with whom they engage. They make archaeology relevant and they show its potential. Contemporary archaeology is, of course, one of the most obvious ways we can effectively deploy archaeology to make a difference in the present world. The field has grown significantly over the last 2 decades since the publication of Victor Buckley and Gavin Lucas's Archaeologies of the Contemporary Past in 2001. There's a wide range of contemporary archaeology research. Some looks at contemporary life using an archaeological lens and mode of analysis. Other aspects consider the archaeology of the recent past, and some think particularly about how the general public interacts with, engages with, and understands archaeology and heritage. Research here is often overtly political. For example, Dan Hicks' 2020 work on the Benin bronzes clearly aims to provoke change. The field is far from homogeneous, overlapping with disciplines such as sociology, anthropology, media, museum studies, geography, and even philosophy. Interdisciplinarity rules in this field. Contemporary archaeology often, though not always, has a focus on the ephemeral, considering protests, conflicts, and waste. It's also often built around a participatory framework, overlapping with the activist archaeology discussed above. I'm thinking here particularly of the work of Rachel Kiddy that works to engage the general public in its practice. Research in this area is firmly centered on how it is that we make the past relevant for the future. One of the long-standing ways archaeology has argued for its contemporary relevance is by suggesting that information from the past can help us understand the challenges we face in the present. This general trend relates closely to the old adage about studying history in order to avoid having it repeat itself. One common example of this is when archaeologists explore how past instances of climate change forced humans to adapt and what that might mean for our current predicament, as well as the study of the emergence of the industrial systems that drive climate change. This work is undoubtedly important, and there are certainly things we can learn from the past. However, it often becomes entangled with a logic that suggests that we can or should return to a past, simpler world where human beings were somehow more in tune with nature. Appealing as that might be, going back in time is not an option. What we need in our current predicament is not a return to the past, but a way forward. We cannot disentangle ourselves from modern technologies and return to allegedly simpler times. Instead, we need new ideas to help us move forward. None of this is to deny that there are definitely things that we can learn from the past, but that the idea of a return to some former, better, simpler time is not possible. There's another reason we should be cautious in offering the pasts we create as archaeologists as a series of cautionary tales. In this kind of thinking, we're treating the past as a resource we can extract knowledge from, which we can apply to improve our conditions in the present. Whilst this does help to explain and demonstrate the value of our subject, it does so in the form of an extractive capitalist relationship with the past, a kind of thinking that I'd rather avoid going forwards. So whilst I embrace activism to improve our discipline, activist archaeology and contemporary archaeology, I want to argue that we can do better than using the past as a source of cautionary tales, and instead argue that there are more critical and productive ways that we can employ archaeology in our contemporary world to help us generate new futures. I want to suggest that the radical potential of archaeology lies in how it helps us to think, and that the kind of thinking that archaeology provokes and challenges us to do allows the discipline to have a positive effect in our world and to help build better futures. Rather than thinking of archaeology as a source of cautionary tales, what if instead we thought of archaeology as a way of teaching us to think differently? What if we used it as a way to explore worlds different than our own and to thereby offer us the means to reflect on our own worlds? What if we worked to reveal the untold histories that challenge our thinking rather than confirm what we think we already know? Now, I know I'm far from alone in saying these things, or finding the reason that I love the subject of archaeology, and indeed anthropology too, so much because of its ability to make me think differently, to see the world in a different way, and to shake the foundations of what I thought I knew. I know for many, the alterity that we find in the past is a real source of inspiration and joy. It is, of course, also a real challenge to our thinking. When we encounter worlds that are radically different, where pots might be bodies, where rocks are alive, or where animals or gods are kin, our thinking is challenged. We are asked to shake the foundation of what we know, to question the principles of what we've been taught. I want to argue tonight that this kind of radical questioning that comes from both archaeology and anthropology is what much of the Western world needs right now. The continuing prevalence of inequalities relates to our inability to move away from systems of thinking that place people in different kinds of categories and apply different values to them. Our volatile politics thrives on binaries, divisions, and oppositions, and we need a way to move beyond it. Our climate crisis does not need incremental steps towards change, but a radical rethink of how we relate to each other and how we relate to the world. We need to learn to think differently. Archaeologists and anthropologists have long been demonstrating other ways to live in the world and other ways to be human. But my argument is that what we need is not more examples, but to use these examples to help create a shift in how Westerners in particular think about themselves and their world. Archaeology alone cannot achieve this, and this kind of work certainly won't make us popular with current government. But archaeology has the potential to help bring about these changes. And that potential is magnified and increased when archaeology is rooted in a theoretical framework that values difference positively, takes a relational approach to the world, and moves away from anthropocentrism. Posthumanism offers such a perspective. So what then is posthumanism? Kay and Horton offer the following definition of posthumanism. They say that it is a gathering of intellectual perspectives that share as a basic tenet the belief that the human subject should not be regarded as a stable, bounded substance with ontological primacy over other beings and things, but rather a decentered phenomenon constituted within immanent networks or flows. So posthumanism is an umbrella term that covers a range of different approaches. These approaches share a critique of humanism. They all argue that humans are not a priori the most important beings on Earth. They demonstrate how this kind of thinking has led to an anthropocentric approach to the world, where we're most concerned by the fate of humans. The kind of intellectual perspectives we might shelter under the posthumanist umbrella include new materialisms, object-oriented ontology, agential realism, ahumanism, and perspectivisms. Within archaeology, some of the core posthumanist strands are becoming increasingly influential. Some archaeologists appear to associate posthumanist approaches most closely with symmetrical archaeology, but there are other strands of thinking that are gaining traction too. Fun as it might be for me, though probably not for you, to dwell on explaining all the different theoretical labels and their histories in more detail, I'm instead going to focus upon the one that I think has the potential to help provoke the most useful rethinking of our worlds, to question the foundations of what we know. Posthumanism from a new materialist perspective that's rooted in feminism. Specifically, I draw heavily on the thinking of Rosie Braidotti and the philosopher Francesco Ferrando, as well as work by Karen Barad, Jane Bennett, and Elizabeth Gross. Ferrando argues that there are three core aspects to posthumanism. First, that it exists as a critique of humanism. Second, that it's post-anthropocentric. And third, that it's post-dualism. So let's take each of these core aspects in turn and explore what they mean. Ferrando argues that posthumanist approaches are all critiques of traditional humanism. She makes a subtle difference in her work between posthumanism, one word, as the umbrella term for the range of approaches, and post/humanism to specifically highlight the aspects of the approaches that exist as a critique of humanism. Braidotti has set the agenda here. In her book, The Posthuman, Braidotti argues that historically, humanism has not granted the same humanity to all humans. It has constructed the category human as a closed and exclusionary notion, and it means that specific types of people have always been seen as more human than others. Braidotti argues that humanism holds up an ideal human, the white, heterosexual, Western, educated, able-bodied and property-owning man, captured for Braidotti in the image on the screen of Vitruvian man. This idealized man is seen as the seat of agency and rationality. All other humans have historically been compared to the ideal human. You can build a link here to Butler's concept of the regulatory ideal. And in that comparison to the ideal human, they have been found lacking. That traditional definition of the human is not only closed and exclusionary, but it's also based on a very specific vision of difference. And this is one of the key areas where current theoretical thinking can sometimes let us down. Difference is normally seen as a negative lack. So women are not men. Similarly, those with differently able bodies are not able-bodied. Those who are LGBTQI+ are not heterosexual, and those who are Black, Indigenous, Latina, or Asian are defined as not white. That which is not man is the other, and therefore defined negatively as less than human and closer to nature. This was, of course, how colonialism was structured and justified. Indigenous people around the world were presented as lacking the rationality and civility of the white European colonist. They were therefore viewed as nearer to nature and less human. Similarly, arguments used to justify the historical exclusion of women from suffrage were structured around the idea that women were less intelligent and rational. And this post-humanist critique builds on decades of feminist theorizing about androcentrism in Western society, and it will feel familiar to many feminists. It differs, though, in how it specifically argues that discrimination against women is constructed ontologically in the same way as other forms of discrimination. It connects together feminist, anti-racist, anti-colonial, intersectional, LGBTQI+, and enabled activists, and suggests that the root of all the inequalities that we face lies in the way we think about this category human, the relationship between humans and the rest of the world, and how we think about difference. This is a feminism that works to dismantle all kinds of discrimination. Its fundamentally relational nature means that it doesn't work for the equality of one individual or one group of individuals, but works to form collectives that aim to achieve equity for all. Braidotti has argued that posthumanism opens up space for a new form of critical posthumanities that focuses on all the missing people excluded from the humanist definition of the human. This new transdisciplinary posthumanities would stitch together scholars from feminist, queer, race, postcolonial, subaltern, cultural, media, and science and technology studies. You can see here in this collective, this ragtag bag of different subjects being brought together, a similarity with contemporary archaeology. This post-humanities, if you will, can be reflected in activism that works across traditional groups to create a larger collective working for equality for all. The post-humanist reconceptualization of difference draws on Gilles Deleuze's thinking to reconceptualize difference not as a lack, but instead as a productive force. This isn't about denying the important differences, for example, between men and women, but instead reconceptualizing them as something positive and productive. In our differences lies productive potential. Deleuze emphasizes difference over identity and argues that difference is primary. For him, there is nothing ontologically essential about identity. It is always in flux. This invites reconceptualization of categories such as men and women. For archaeologists, this leaves space for us to both explore how gender was understood differently at different times and in different places in the past. To see an excellent example of the potential of this rethinking of difference, I'd point you to the work of Penny Bickle, who applies this Deleuzian concept of difference to a study of gender in the Central European Neolithic. Let's move on to the next aspect of posthumanism. A post-anthropocentric approach is a critique of human exceptionalism that argues that we should no longer place humans at the ontological apex in our analyses, but instead recognize the key role played by non-humans. This involves a decentering of humans as the chief protagonists of history and an active effort to elevate the role of non-human others. This is often framed around the concept of a flat ontology drawn from the work of Manuel de Landa, which critiques the hierarchical ontology of the modern West, where humans sit above animals, plants, and things, and suggests this hierarchy should be flattened so that all things, both human and non-human, are positioned on the same ontological plane. And this ontological flattening removes humans from being the sole authors of change and agency in the world, and instead offers a role for non-humans in the production of history. The flat ontology is controversial. Some have argued that it results in the treatment of all things from kettles to elephants to people as the same. This is not the case. Post-anthropocentric approaches don't suggest that humans and non-humans are the same. Coffee cups and prime ministers are clearly quite different. Equally, coffee cups and plates are also clearly different. Rather, the ontological leveling that goes on here is about allowing for the possibility that gases, petrol stations, prime ministers, and novel viruses, to give just a few current examples, could have an effect on the world. Starting with a flat ontology doesn't mean ending with one. In our analyses of the past, we can think about which types of entities were important and powerful. Were gods more powerful than people? Were things understood on the same terms as animals? Were animals equal with humans? A post-anthropocentric approach makes it easy to carry out analyses of societies different from our own. We can combine the posthumanism from the previous slide with our post-anthropocentrism to argue that the human who sits at the ontological apex in humanist thinking is not every human, but a specific form of human, something you can see in my choice of illustration here. It's of note here that the approach is post-anthropocentric, not non-anthropocentric. I'm not arguing that we no longer study humans. To do so at the RAI would be a bit bold, but just that we relocate humans amongst all the others with whom we share the planet. The final core aspect of posthumanist approaches is their shared rejection of dualistic and binary thinking. In archaeology, the critique of dualisms has been emerging for decades and is most clearly articulated in Julian Thomas's work, Archaeology and Modernity. Dualistic thinking has its origins in the work of European thinkers like Descartes. In archaeology, though, we often study groups who exist in times and places untouched by Descartes. Julian Thomas and others like Joe Brooke have long argued that the imposition of binaries and dualisms is inappropriate. In other subjects who don't enter into such ridiculous concerns as working out the problem of how people in the past thought about their own lives, they have also critiqued dualisms. The work of Bruno Latour has shown that whilst Westerners often think in binaries, the reality is a world of messy hybrids that ignores dualisms. Similarly, anthropologists have shown that there are other communities around the world who don't think in this way. Most often, this is explored by considering the nature-culture binary, something prevalent in the West that doesn't exist for many indigenous groups, who instead see themselves as embedded in and inseparable from the so-called natural world. It's notable that it's really rare in archaeology to see our authors attack the critique on dualisms, although there is a book that critiques it more broadly by Malm. In archaeology, we either tend to embrace the critique of dualisms or just not mention it at all. We can again combine our post-dualist critique with our post-humanism to think about the ways in which binaries have often been put to work in a hierarchical manner. Embedded in these binaries is a sense that the cultural is superior to the natural because it's associated with human exceptionalism. Our dualisms have been part of the thinking that has defined some humans as less human, less rational, more wild. In place of dualistic and binary thinking, relational approaches have begun to proliferate, including arguments for Latourian networks and assemblages drawing from the thinking of Deleuze and Delander, and those coming from Indigenous scholars, which emphasize relational understandings of the world. The work of Zoe Todd offers an important lens on the relationship between Indigenous and Western thinkers in their critiques of dualisms. Posthumanism parallels a range of relational Indigenous worldviews by offering an approach that better understands our world, not as one where humans are ontologically superior and where dualisms structure our thinking. Discussion of these parallels highlights how much posthumanists have to learn from Indigenous thinking, and more importantly, the need to do so in a respectful, careful, and non-extractive or appropriating manner. In archaeology to date, relational approaches have offered a key critique of dualisms and a different way to think about past communities at both the ontological and the epistemological level. The vision of the human that emerges from posthumanist approaches is quite different from the humanist vision of the human. Humans are unseated from the ontological apex and relocated in and amongst the non-humans with whom they share the world. Human remains an open rather than a closed concept. Open in the different types of people are allowed into the category, and open in the sense that the human is seen as embedded in and inseparable from the rest of the world. They are part of and affected by ecologies. Humans are always relational beings who emerge from the relations that they are entangled within, with both humans and non-humans. Perhaps most importantly for archaeology, this means that what the human is always historically specific. Who counts as human and what human is understood to be always in motion and always changing. The human is no longer a closed category defined by a certain biology that we achieved 500,000 years ago. As Tim Ingold, the previous co-lecturer, has been arguing since the 2000s, human biology didn't stop changing when Homo sapiens emerged. Making the definition of the human open allows us to think about how our biology has changed in relation to our ecologies and experiences. Similarly, embedding within relations with all kinds of non-humans, from hand axes to Fitbits, changes what humans are and what their bodies can do. Posthumanism and postanthropocentrism are controversial. These are not ideas that are openly embraced by everyone. Despite this, it is my belief that now more than ever, these are theoretical frameworks and ways of understanding our world that Westerners need. Posthumanism is gaining increasing traction because it appears to be a particularly good fit for the world we live in. A world defined by late capitalism and the climate crisis, a world where we lead increasingly technologically mediated lives, where we live in sync with our technologies, sleeping beside mobile phones that bring us scrolling news from around the world, and where fact and fiction can merge together. A world where we see the stubborn persistence of racism and the patriarchy amidst the emergence of a plethora of forms of discrimination. As we begin to appreciate the true scope of our climate crisis and the current mass extinctions that are underway, it becomes increasingly clear that our anthropocentrism has allowed the West to develop a deeply problematic relationship with non-humans and has, through colonialism, attempted to export this way of thinking across the world. Plants, animals, materials, things, and the environment have all become resources that Westerners control, own, and shape for our own purposes. We think about what they can do for us, and we think about ourselves as separate from them. We continue to give ourselves at least 50% of the ontological space, relegating all the non-humans to a status of less than. Seeing ourselves as exceptional has led us to believe that we're the only beings endowed with rationality and education on Earth. Our humanism also serves to make some of us more human than others. On the one hand, we live in arguably increasingly anti-racist and feminist times, as the Black Lives Matter and Me Too political movements demonstrate. On the other hand, the growth of transphobia, hideous statistics about domestic violence, rape, and hate crimes, and the small handful of female leaders suggest that more change is needed. As Braidotti demonstrates, humanism's definition of the humanism excludes a great many who are presented as less rational, nearer to nature, and thereby less human. It presents difference as negative and allows the lives of some humans to be valued more than others. And our climate crisis is already affecting many communities who have been traditionally excluded by humanism more severely than those who have been enmeshed in some of the more damaging assemblages that have contributed to the crisis. Climate justice is a post-humanist issue. In this format, it should be clear that posthumanism is a political project. It's about changing our attitude to other humans and changing our attitude to the non-humans that we share the world with. This form of posthumanism is not one which is apolitical, and it's not one that doesn't care about social justice or about humans, and it's not one that's unconcerned with power relations and inequality. Rather, in this form, firmly rooted in an intersectional feminism, posthumanism is deeply political and aims at producing a better world. The three core aspects of posthumanism are about making those changes in our thinking. A critique of humanism is about rejecting a closed definition of the human that excludes the majority of our species. Postanthropocentrism is about understanding that humans are not exceptional and instead relocating them as embodied subjects, thoroughly embedded and entangled in a world of non-humans. And post-dualistic thinking is about accepting how truly entangled we are and moving beyond the binaries that have produced exclusionary definitions. Defined in these terms, this is a philosophy of the moment, rooted in an ethical commitment to all those we share the earth with. It's committed to affirmative change. Posthumanist feminism also asks us to move away from telling what Gilles Deleuze would describe as majoritarian histories, and instead to write about the minoritarian, the forgotten stories and pasts from the missing people and the missing non-humans. This might mean thinking about the role of women or people of colour in the past, areas that feminist scholarship has long called on us to address. It can also involve thinking about how non-humans have played key roles in history. The materialist nature of posthumanism means that there's fertile ground for studies that trace material histories and consider how specific materials are entwined with variously historically emergent phenomena. For example, we might map a material history of the patriarchy, exploring how this phenomena changes and adapts over time, its differing effects, and the cracks within it. Imagine a future-oriented archaeology where we use our work to highlight how current inequities and damaging structures aren't permanent. We need to reveal the histories that produce them, both showing why they're so powerful and intransient, and provoking thinking about how things could be otherwise. These changes require us to ask different research questions. An important move here will be to begin to rethink the grand narrative that archaeology has produced. That's a grand narrative of linear progress. And instead replace it with multiple alternative grand narratives, plural, multiple narratives. This is something that I began to argue for in my book, Change and Archaeology. For me, this is one of the key ways in which we as archaeologists have to challenge the status quo and question thinking that suggests we today are at the pinnacle of human achievement. Combining archaeology and posthumanism gives us the ability to show that what humans are and what they can be is in motion. It's changed before and it's always changing. And that is a really powerful tool. I'm sure you're thinking at this point that I'm another one of those radical young millennials hopped up on my avocado toast and activism. Maybe so. A review of my book on change suggested it could be read as a self-help guide, which made me laugh no end. But if we go back to my earlier argument, why should we keep practicing archaeology in the face of all the difficulties we currently face? My argument is that the value of archaeology lies in its radical capacity to make us think differently about our world. And it's that thinking differently that Westerners in particular need now. There are, of course, other cultures and communities who already think in these ways, who don't need their foundations shaking or their assumptions questioning. But for Westerners, posthumanism offers us a way to address the politics of now. I'm not saying that archaeology is the only way to do this, or that I'm suggesting it will be easy. It certainly won't be popular with the current UK government. Rather, that this is a way that we can contribute to building better futures. Archaeology provides us with a way to ground challenging and radical thinking in material examples. It also allows for really effective storytelling. It draws people in, it engages them, and it allows us to challenge how they think. It offers us a way to show worlds otherwise, and thereby offers us the means to show others how to think differently and to shake up the foundations of what we think. This isn't the past as a resource we can exploit or as an ideal world to which we can return, but the past as something that will challenge how we think about our world now and how we build our future. Thank you very much for listening.
Rachel, thank you so very much indeed. And you kept absolutely perfectly to time. You promised us 50 minutes, and that's exceptional. Thank you so much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, can I just remind you that there is the chat box, because I'm sure there are a huge range of different questions that you have for Rachel. And Rachel, I'm just going to take you back to almost what was that first slide that you showed, which was in relation to the split between men and women in archaeology and age in archaeology, and the classic sort of demographics of what we perceive as being the discipline at this time. If you were to go to an average, if there is such a thing, an average child in an average school, what sort of a view do you think that young generation would have of archaeology? What does it mean to be an archaeologist? Because aren't they the ones that we really need to get to if we're going to change the profile? They're the lifeblood, the future lifeblood of the discipline. What do they see archaeology as?
That's a really interesting question. I'm actually going to slightly dispute what you've just said. So I think
I didn't say it was my view, but yeah.
I think a young person who is sat in a classroom, many of them are hugely engaged with archaeology. They find it fascinating because they see that world of discovery, that world of digging stuff up, and it is hugely engaging. I've been lucky enough to work with lots of school kids as part of my dig project, and it's not hard to get them enthusiastic for a muddy afternoon. They are already into it. The problem comes when they get a bit older. It comes when they think about what job do you get as an archaeologist, and how much money might you earn, and is it a profession that you can stay in? And the statistics that show that our archaeologists are relatively even between two genders when they're kind of entering the profession and then they're leaving. That's where our problem is. It's getting people to want to do archaeology at university, which is why we're seeing the issues that we've seen around Worcester, around Sheffield, around Chester and Hull. That is where that problem comes from. And then once they've got their degree, it's convincing them that they want to stay in that field. And when the field isn't welcoming enough, when people don't see chances for progression, or when they can't see the point in what they're doing, that kind of the feelings of despair that we talk about, and that sense that we want to make a difference, you have to have some sense that what you're going to do is worthwhile, and that it has the possibilities to support, you know, a career or whatever we might want to have. And I think that's the challenging bit. It's how we do that, and that takes structural change to the discipline and all that kind of stuff. So I think our young person sees it as that exciting thing that they grasp, that they're entering a space where the rules aren't the same in archaeology, and that they're able to discover things that they find exciting. And we might want to question that heavy trope of discovery and what that's doing for archaeology and the relation that has with colonialism. But where we need more help, I think, is a bit later in that process.
And if you could wave that archaeological magic wand, what is the one thing that you would change that would affect that change happening? What would be that critical moment that says, I need policy, I need whatever it is, you know, what would make that change, that step change?
I think, unfortunately, in the world of capitalism, it's probably wages in the commercial archaeology sector, which is the thing that we really need to tackle. We can't hope to retain a diverse workforce if we are not going to pay. And if we are set to see a series of changes, knowing that I'm speaking to a baroness right now, if we're set to see a series of changes in planning law that are going to make archaeology done quicker and for less money and make it more difficult to do archaeology, then that is not going to help us drive up wages, which is what we need to diversify that sector. And there's all this great activist work going on, and it's doing really important things. But unfortunately, wages, I think, are probably the other really big issue that we need to think about.
Yeah, because I mean, what you're discussing is what we sometimes call the void sandwich, which is you have a huge amount of interest that come in from younger people because they see the excitement of the subject, that, as you say, the lack of rules in some regard that give them huge imagination. then they almost immerse themselves in the real world, where a lot of that enthusiasm for the subject has to give way to living. But when they retire, they come back to the subject with a huge amount of enthusiasm. If we could just solve the void in the middle of the sandwich, wouldn't that work?
Yeah, I mean, Leicester has a huge distance learning program, and a huge chunk of my students are people who wanted to be archaeologists as kids, then went and had a serious job, and then come back and do it as they retire. And you're right, that void sandwich is a really good way to think about that problem.
Thank you. Amanda, I need to stop talking. So do we have some questions? Because I could keep talking to Rachel all night. Do you have some questions from us in the chat?
At the moment, I don't have any questions from the chat, but I'd also like to remind people that if you want to kind of ask a question out loud, you can just raise your hand and we'll promote you. You don't have to stay in the, and I see Judith is got her hand up.
Lovely. Judith Oakley. Just bear with us a second till we unmute you.
Unmute.
There we go.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that fascinating new perspective. I didn't study archaeology, but anthropology. And what I wanted to ask was, were there class differences as to who chose archaeology? You know, I was professor at Edinburgh, and I remember one year there were 9 Etonians doing anthropology. And in Hull, where I taught anthropology, it was compulsory for 1 term at the beginning. And these were working class kids, and they absolutely loved it, but they'd never, ever heard of the subject before. And also I've taught in prisons. And again, the underprivileged prisoners were taught some aspects of anthropology, and they loved it. But what, of course, our RAI, we wanted to found a level in anthropology. And my aim was so as to encourage a younger generation to know the subject so that they would enroll at university. But I wondered if there's equally a class difference as to who understands archaeology.
Thank you, Judith. That's a brilliant question. And as archaeologists, we used to benefit from having an A-level in archaeology, and I think we benefit from archaeology being better known than anthropology is amongst young people, absolutely. Despite that, I do still think there isn't amazing data on class in that sense, but what we can say is that the way that archaeology has historically been structured has, of course, given it a class bias, and that continues. In particular, those low wages that we see mean that it becomes inaccessible for a range of people who don't want to be in a job where the starting salary is £15,000 after 3 years at university, paying £9,500 a year. That doesn't seem appealing to them. And so in the same way, archaeology remains something for privileged white people because of all of these kinds of issues that we see. And our ability to tell those stories that are going to provoke the wider human population to think differently relies on getting more diverse people through the door in order that we can think about things in a different way and that we can tell those different stories. So I think, unfortunately, the situation is really similar to what you're saying. And in the same instance, you're saying, you know, you work with school kids and they really liked it, or that you worked with prisoners. We see the exact same thing in archaeology. So when archaeology is taken to groups that have mental health problems, they absolutely love it. They find it really inspiring and really helps drive improvements in their mental health. When it's taken to veterans, they find the same thing, and work with homeless people as well. Amazing work by Rachel Kiddy in particular, working with homeless people and their own archaeology and heritage, has shown how hugely engaged they can be and how helpful it can be. But again, we have that same kind of exclusion issue. If we take it to people, they like it, but getting through is the problem that we're kind of facing, I think.
Just end with an example, which is that at Hull, you know, they had a compulsory course in anthropology, but they'd registered for sociology. And there was one amazing Muslim student who'd suffered bullying at school and everything. In fact, she'd gone to prison because she'd responded to the bullying. And then she did anthropology and she got a brilliant first-class degree. And she said, I never knew the subject, but my difference was celebrated. She'd been bullied at school for being different in the North. And then she loved it because her difference of skin color and everything was celebrated. But anyway, thank you very much for all those different perspectives that get me thinking.
Difference is productive and positive.
Thank you, Judith.
I've got a question here from Monica Hanna in the chat. And she asks, how do you think of relating archaeology to development and sustainable development to create relevant jobs?
Okay, that's a big question in itself. Slightly questioning whether we're on development in kind of like building development i.e. in relation to the commercial archaeology sector, or whether we're talking about kind of sustainable development in relation to work, for example, in the global south. In either case, in the world of kind of relating it to development and sustainability, I think showing the value that archaeology brings to commercial developments, you know, the production of new housing or schools or whatever, having that archaeological excavation work done first can be really important in the sense of place that people have and that understanding of where they're from, and indeed the understanding that they are a part of a landscape and a place. So there's really interesting work going on looking at kind of industrial ex-industrial areas and how people do or don't feel attached to their heritage. This is something that Neil Redfern from the CBA has talked a lot about, and this was before we saw the recent pulling down of the Dorman Long Tower, saying that, you know, people whose heritage is taken away feel disconnected and like they are less kind of less human, if you like, that they don't have a heritage and a past. So if we're talking about development in that kind of building sense, then yes, those are good ways. Sustainable development projects in terms of kind of like ecological issues and things along those lines, I think that there are some important things that we need to do to make archaeology have a bit less of an environmental impact. So I'm not quite sure if I've answered your question, Monica, but if you want to pop anything else or get me to clarify, then feel free to pop that into the chat.
Thank you. There's another thing to find out.
Yes, I've got another question. This one's from Robert Hedge. And he says, really inspiring talk. Thank you. How do we improve the gap between the practical and the theoretical? How do we embed your valuable theoretical perspectives into the way we work day to day?
I'm going to say for a start that I think is the Rob Hedge who I cited in my talk earlier, who talks about the wonderful fun of archaeology. So how do we improve the gap between the practical and the theoretical? I think we do it by embedding our theory in things. So taking theory away from being nebulous concepts that we talk about and instead giving people concrete examples that they can grasp onto. Now, some of those people we do that with needs to be archaeologists themselves, so that when they go out and work in the commercial sector, theory is still a part of what's going on in their brains. And some of that needs to work at kind of different levels as well with people who kind of are already doing. And I think when we talk about theory and we embed it in examples, what do you do when you've got this pot? How do you think about a world from a pot? How do you build past worlds? What do you do when you've got that material in front of you? I think that is what gives theoretical concepts traction. It's examples and material things that allow people to rethink the world, to have that image in their head that shifts and says, oh, things don't have to be this way. And I think embedding concepts in material examples, which is something that as archaeologists we should be awesome at, is the way to connect that kind of theoretical with the practical day-to-day stuff.
And then I've got another one from Catriona. This is really kind of a clarification. Catriona McGlade, she wants to know, who was the author you mentioned about in relation to the tower being torn down and not having heritage making you feel less human?
So Neil Redfern, who is the director of the CBA, has spoken in a lot of recent talks about the need for local communities to have their own heritage and feel connected to their own sense of place. I don't know whether he's published extensively on that. It's an argument I've seen him make in public lots of different times. So he talks about kind of groups he's worked with in Yorkshire who say, well, all the industrial heritage is gone, but that's who we are, that's our community. And that kind of idea of not having heritage making you feel less human, we also see in the work of Rachel Kiddie with homeless people. So when she's working with homeless people, she talks to them about the archaeology that they're doing together. And she's looking through literally the debris, if you like, of homelessness, the materials left behind in parks or wherever. And she has these kind of interactions with them, which she's published in a whole series of papers and her excellent book, where they talk about saying, oh, I didn't really realize I had a heritage, a past, if you like, because I didn't really feel like I was worthy or worthwhile. And that taps, she doesn't talk about it in posthumanist terms, but it really neatly kind of sits in those terms as a way of rethinking it.
Thank you. Can I ask if there are any other questions, or if anybody would like to raise their hand and ask the question themselves rather than place it into the chat, because it's always nice to have another voice at the end of the microphone. We'll just give you a couple of minutes. We've had a lot of attendees, and I wonder, Rachel, if you were in predicting mode,
oh God.
if you had 10p on this bet, what was the proportion, do you reckon, of males to females in your audience?
I have no idea.
I asked you, you were predicting.
Maybe slightly more women than men. Feminism is quite an appealing title, I think, to... So
I'm just being slightly provocative in asking the question, because as you were talking, the statistician in me went through and had a look. So 3/4 of the people at tonight's lecture are women, and 1/4 were men. Do you think, how do we get the message across that we all need to be talking about this? I know it appeals to certain sectors, and we clearly have a very enlightened group here, but how do we get that message across to all sectors, not just to those who are really interested in the subject?
I think it's about opening up the way in which, so a lot of people think like feminist is a female issue, right? But the structure of the patriarchy hurts all of us, or that racism is only an issue for Black, Indigenous, Asian, Latina people, but it isn't. It works in ways that hurt all of us. And I think showing the way in which these things impact, it's quite perhaps more easily in many ways done with feminism, when you look at, oh, the reason you can't be at home with your child because you're out at work is because of the way these things are structured. And I think that's a really important thing that we're still working on. I think in some ways feminism as a term carries that baggage, doesn't it? That it's about a series of bra-burning, men-hating women who want to change the world. And recent debates, feminism has not covered itself in glory of late necessarily, with a lot of the kind of the arguments that have gone on, in particular in relation to trans rights. I think thinking about how we show the way in which we would all live in a better world if it weren't structured by discriminatory systems is the really important thing to do. And, you know, if I were a less committed theorist than I am, if you remove the word feminism from the title, you might have got a more evenly spread audience, perhaps.
And I think that's really important, because what we're talking about here, sometimes the lexicon can get in our way. And you know, maybe we need to have much more of these open discussions to try and remove some of the misconceptions.
Yeah.
I think we have possibly got to the end of the evening. I just want to say it's been such an incredible pleasure. You have been absolutely amazing to listen to. Your commitment, your enthusiasm absolutely shines out of you. And I think your students are inordinately lucky people to be able to have a teacher who has that level of inspiration, commitment, but also approachability. And so I believe that archaeology and its future is in good hands if it's in people who have these absolutely committed views that you do. So on behalf of the Royal Anthropological Institute and myself, all of our fellows, all of those who've attended this evening, Rachel, it has been an absolute delight. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That's very kind and generous. It's been a real honour to have delivered the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Henning and Amanda, can I hand over to you for
Yes.
a wind up? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you everybody for coming along, and I hope you all enjoyed it. And we will see you soon at another RAI event online, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye now.